In the autumn of 1961, in the limestone hill country outside a cheese-making town in northern Vermont, an old man learned that the very thing sent to ruin him would be the thing that made him. That October. The tanker trucks from Kessler Dairy and Cheese began arriving twice a week, grinding up the rutted lane that ran along the western edge of Elias Thorne's hay ground, and without so much as a wave through the windshield. They backed to the low end of his pasture, and let a river of thin, sour-smelling yellow-green liquid run out across the grass. It was whey, the watery leftover the cheese vats spat out after the curds had been dipped away, and the Kessler plant had more of it than the county's ditches could swallow. It spread across Elias' bottomland in sheets that caught the low autumn sun like dirty glass. And within days the smell of it faintly of sour milk, and something almost like vinegar hung over his 40 acres the way a fog hangs over a river before the sun burns it off. Elias stood at the edge of that first flood with his cap pushed back, and his boots already soaked through, and watched the driver swing back up into his cab without a word. And he understood exactly what was being told to him, without a syllable of it being spoken aloud. The spring that fed his lower pasture ran the coldest, cleanest water in 3 townships, and Bartholomew Kessler, who owned the cheese plant and half the paper on half the farms along that valley, had been trying to buy the water rights to that spring for 4 years running. Elias had turned him down every time, gently the first 2 times and flatly the last 2, and this, the sudden generous offer of the plant's own liquid waste, dumped free of charge onto a widower's least productive ground, was Kessler's 4th conversation. It did not use words either. Everyone in town believed the same thing that fall, the thing Elias himself might have believed if his own father had not spent 30 years teaching him to look twice at anything a smart man called worthless. They believed that whey poured raw and cold onto living pasture would burn the grass roots black sour the soil, until nothing but thistle would grow there again. And that a cheese plant's runoff was exactly what the state agricultural office already called it in its own pamphlets, a disposal problem fit only for the municipal lagoon or the nearest ditch that led away fast enough. Elias walked the low pasture that evening with a lantern, crouching to touch the puddled whey where it had already begun to soak into the turf, and he caught in it, underneath the sourness, something else, a sweetness, a weight of substance that plain ditch water never carried. He did not see poison. He saw protein and lactose and minerals his exhausted hay ground had been begging for since before his wife died. He saw, in other words, the beginning of a question that would follow him through the 2 hardest and most rewarding years of his life. What happens when the thing sent to destroy your land turns out to be exactly what your land has been starving for? Elias Thorne was 61 years old that fall, a lean, weathered man with a farmer's permanent stoop from 35 years of haying and fence work, and a reputation in 3 townships for being stubborn past the point most men called sensible. His late wife Margaret had died of a bad heart the winter before leaving him alone in the farmhouse. His grandfather had built stone by stone in 1889 alone, except for his hired man, a rangy, taciturn Quebecois named Gaspard Boucher, who had worked the Thorne place since before Elias' own boy had grown up and moved to Burlington for a job that didn't smell like manure. Elias farmed 110 acres, most of it in hay and pasture for a small herd of dairy shorthorns, and in recent years a growing flock of border Leicester sheep he had started almost as a hobby and kept because the wool checks small as they were never once bounced. When word got around the general store and the Grange Hall that Elias intended to let the Kessler plant keep dumping its whey on his bottom pasture, instead of driving the trucks off his land, the way any sensible man would, the laughter came fast. And it came loudest from the men who considered themselves too clever to be fooled by anything. Harlan Speck, who ran the feed and grain and fancied himself the valley's foremost authority on anything that grew, told the checkers game at the store that Elias Thorne had finally let grief curdle his brains, along with everything else, that raw whey would scald that pasture worse than a summer drought, and that the sheep would be dead of scours before Christmas if they so much as grazed near it. Ruth Callender, who kept the books at the co-op creamery and heard every piece of gossip that passed through the valley twice, said she'd heard Kessler's own plant manager laughing about it over coffee, saying they were doing old Thorne a favor letting him have the whey free, instead of paying to truck it to the lagoon in St. Albans, since at least this way it would eventually just soak away and be done with, rather than let him go on pretending that spring of his was worth what he thought it was. Bartholomew Kessler himself, when his name came up, only smiled the patient smile of a man already counting his winnings, certain that within a season Elias' stubbornness would leave him with a dead pasture and a diminished flock, and that the modest offer still sitting unsigned on the kitchen table, considerably lower now than it had been 2 years before, would finally start to look like wisdom even to a man as pig-headed as Elias Thorne. Elias heard most of this secondhand through Gaspard, who reported the valley's opinion of him the same flat way he reported the weather. And Elias only grunted and kept hauling buckets of the settled whey out to test on a corner of the garden, first the way his father had always told him to test anything new on ground you could afford to lose before you trusted it on ground you couldn't. What the valley did not know and what Elias had spent that whole first autumn reading about by lamplight in a stack of agricultural extension bulletins, and a dog-eared soil science text his son had mailed him from the university library in Burlington was that sweet whey. The liquid left after cheese-making was in fact loaded with exactly what his thin overhead pasture had been quietly starving for across a decade of poor rotation and no manure to spare. Lactose, milk sugar, that fed soil microbes the way sugar feeds anything. Protein residues rich in nitrogen. Phosphorus and potassium and calcium left behind when the curd was lifted away. All of it still dissolved in the liquid the cheese plant considered trash. The trouble, and it was a real trouble, one that had ruined plenty of pastures downstream of plenty of careless cheese houses over the years, was concentration and timing. Whey applied too heavy, too often, or too cold off the vat did exactly what Harlan Speck predicted. It scalded the grass, oversaturated the soil with salts, and left a stinking, slick crust that killed roots as surely as a hard frost killed tomatoes. Elias understood this correctly. He had no intention of letting the truck simply dump and drive off the way they'd started doing. He built, that first winter, a system his own father would have recognized from the lean years after the First War, though no one in 3 counties had bothered to apply it at this scale to a plant's liquid waste. A shallow holding pond first, dug by hand and by borrowed backhoe into a natural low spot below the spring. Lined with clay he hauled up from a stream bank 2 farms over, so that the whey could settle and cool and separate before it ever touched living ground. From the pond, a network of ditches and later, a hand-laid system of perforated clay pipe that let him meter the liquid out across the pasture in measured passes, rather than let the truck simply flood the low end all at once. Gaspard helped him rig an old horse-drawn manure spreader tank patched, and retard so that they could haul diluted whey up to the higher drier hay fields a bucket and barrel at a time through the coldest months. Spreading it thin the way a man spreads seed rather than the way a truck spreads garbage. Elias drove into St. Johnsbury that November to buy a soil pH kit and a hydrometer meant for testing cream density at the creamery. Because he intended to measure his whey applications the way the plant measured its own vats, by number rather than by nose spending money, he could not entirely spare to do it. He learned that first winter and into the spring, the ratio that mattered most, one that meant nothing to Harlan Speck arguing checkers moves at the store: dilution. Raw whey straight from the vat carried a biological demand on the soil that was simply too heavy to apply undiluted, the same way undiluted manure would burn a field brown in a week. Elias settled. After ruining one small test strip badly enough in December to make him wince every time he walked past it, that spring on a rule of roughly 1 part, settled whey to 4 parts water for any ground getting its first application. Thinning even further on the coldest days when the soil's own microbial life slowed nearly to sleep and could not process the sugars fast enough to keep the ground from souring. He learned to watch not the smell of the field which stayed sourish no matter what he did, but the color of the grass at the crown and the give of the turf underfoot, testing pH with his little kit every week through that first winter, and adjusting his dilution the way a man adjusts a recipe: more water when the reading crept too acid. A scattering of wood ash from his own stove when it needed buffering further. He tracked every application, every reading, every load in a ledger he kept on the kitchen table where Margaret's sewing basket used to sit, and some nights Gaspard would find him there past midnight, doing sums by lamplight, and say nothing at all, only bank the stove and go to bed the way he'd learned to do with a man who thought best in silence. The neighbors who drove past that winter saw only a strange grid of ditches cut into a pasture that smelled faintly of sour milk, even in a hard freeze, and steam rising off the holding pond on the coldest mornings like a small, patient ghost. And most of them shook their heads and drove on toward Speck's stove, and the certainty of easy company, sure they were watching a lonely old widower waste a bad season on foolishness. Never once climbing down to put a hand into that ditch water the way Elias did every single evening, checking not the smell, but the pH, not the mess, but the number in the ledger, because numbers, unlike opinion, did not much care what the store thought of him. By the second week of April 1962, the low pasture that had received the careful, diluted metered whey all winter came up green, nearly 2 weeks ahead of every other field on the Thorne place, and a full 3 weeks ahead of Harlan Speck's own hay ground a mile up the road. It was not merely early. It was a different color of green entirely, a deep, almost black green that Elias had seen only once before. On a rented field he'd top-dressed heavy with barn manure back before the war, and it stood taller by the 3rd week of May, thick enough at the base that Gaspard, walking it with him one cool evening, crouched down, pulled a fistful up by the roots, and turned it over in his hand for a long moment before saying in the flattest voice he owned that he had never in 30 years of haying in that valley seen a stand come up like that off ground that had spent a whole winter under cheese plant runoff. Wool prices that spring sat around 41 cents a pound, unremarkable in themselves, the kind of number that made every extra pound per fleece matter to a man rebuilding a flock on a shoestring. And Elias walked that low pasture nearly every morning that spring with a tape measure and his ledger, comparing growth against the previous 3 years' notes, watching a pattern take shape that felt almost too generous to trust. Rain came heavy that May. The kind of wet spring that in past years had left his thinner ground waterlogged and sour at the crown. But the Whey-treated pasture drained differently, the improved tilth letting water move through rather than pool. And it showed none of the yellowing that crept into his upper hay fields during the wettest stretch of the month. His flock turned out onto that pasture in early June, put on flesh faster than any year Gaspard could remember, and the lambs, twin-heavy that spring, grew leggy and thick-coated in a way that drew comment even from men who had spent the winter laughing about Elias Thorne's sour ditch-cut pasture. Harlan Speck, driving past on his way to deliver feed to another customer, slowed his truck long enough that summer to look hard at the dark, dense stand of grass on ground the whole valley had written off as ruined, and drove on without comment. Though Ruth Callender reported at the creamery the following week that Harlan had gone unusually quiet on the subject of Elias Thorne's pasture for the first time all spring. The following autumn 1962, Elias expanded the operation past a single test pasture into a full working system across all 40 of his bottom acres, no longer treating it as an experiment he might have to abandon, but as the backbone of a flock and a herd he intended to build in earnest. The Kessler plant's trucks kept coming twice weekly all through that second year, still dumping their way at his gate under the same standing arrangement, Bartholomew Kessler's own paperwork, classified plainly and repeatedly as waste disposal, rather than any kind of purchase or partnership. Since no one at the plant had yet noticed that the farmer receiving their liquid garbage had stopped complaining about it months ago and had if anything started asking for more, Elias refined his system that second year, cutting his dilution ratio slightly as his soil's microbial life built up capacity to handle richer applications, and adding a late innovation borrowed from a Cornell extension bulletin his son mailed him that spring. A thin annual dressing of ground limestone worked into the driest upper fields to buffer the acidity the Whey left behind over repeated seasons, a small adjustment that let him push his application rate up nearly a third without souring the ground. By the autumn shearing of 1963, the difference in fleece weight and lamb weaning weight between his Whey-fed pasture and his conventionally managed hay ground had grown from encouraging to impossible to ignore his flock's average fleece, running nearly 2 pounds heavier per animal than the county average. A gap large enough that even the county agricultural agent, a careful, unhurried man named Delbert Prout, who had never before had cause to visit the Thorne place, drove out that October after hearing the numbers repeated at a Grange meeting he'd assumed were exaggeration. Prout walked the pastures with Elias for the better part of an afternoon, took soil samples from both the treated bottomland and the untreated upper fields, and left promising to send the samples to the State Agricultural Laboratory in Burlington, a promise that unsettled Elias more than it pleased him. Since state attention was not something a man quietly making do off another company's dumped byproduct necessarily wanted, though he told Prout plainly nothing at all to hide. Word of the agent's visit moved through the valley faster than the wool checks themselves had. And for the first time, the talk at Speck's store shifted from mockery to a wary, grudging curiosity, with men who had laughed loudest the previous winter now finding reasons to drive the long way past the Thorne place on their errands. Bartholomew Kessler heard about it too, from one of his own drivers who mentioned almost offhand one morning that the Thorne place seemed to be doing something clever with all that Whey rather than simply enduring it. And Kessler, sharp enough a businessman to recognize when a stray fact mattered before he understood exactly why, told his plant manager to start keeping a closer account of what happened to the Whey after it left his tanker trucks, a small instruction that would within another year prove to be the very thread that unraveled everything he thought he had already won. The trouble arrived in the late winter of 1964, not from weather or disease or any failure in Elias' careful system, but from a letter carried out to the farm by Kessler's own attorney, a precise, city-suited man from Montpelier, who parked a car far too clean for the valley's mud season in Elias' dooryard, and informed him in language dense enough that Elias had to read it twice at the kitchen table that evening, with Gaspard reading silently over his shoulder. That Kessler Dairy and Cheese was asserting a continuing ownership interest in the fleece and lamb crop produced from ground fertilized with the company's Whey, and demanding Elias cease selling wool or lambs derived from that pasture without compensating the company for the raw material that had made the improved yield possible in the first place. The letter had come, Elias learned soon enough through Ruth Callender's careful listening at the creamery, because Kessler's own supplier of commercial nitrogen fertilizer for the pasture land he leased out to other farmers in the next township had raised prices sharply that winter at precisely the moment word had spread among a handful of neighboring sheep men that Elias Thorne of all people was quietly producing the heaviest, glossiest fleeces in the county off pasture, fed with nothing but diluted cheese plant runoff and a little limestone. An agronomist Kessler had sent out that autumn ostensibly to inspect drainage from the plant's own disposal operation had in fact walked Elias' fields and confirmed privately to Kessler that the man's pasture management, however unlikely, its origin was producing results superior to anything the commercial fertilizer trade could offer at any price. Kessler wanted that advantage for his own leased ground, needed it in fact. And rather than approach Elias as a customer wanting to license or purchase the method of pasture that would have required him to admit, he needed something from a farmer he had spent 4 years trying to strong-arm off his own spring. He had instructed his lawyer to claim a stake in the results, instead arguing that since the raw whey originated at his plant, any value created from it downstream remained at least in part his own property. Elias sat with that letter long into the night. His father's old fencing hammer catching lamplight from the hook by the door where it always hung, and he understood that Kessler's claim rested on a single point of logic, that Elias believed with the same quiet certainty he'd felt crouched over that first puddle of whey back in 1961. Was provably documentably false. He drove into St. Johnsbury the following morning and requested from the county clerk's office copies of every waste disposal manifest Kessler Dairy and Cheese had filed with the State Water Quality Board over the previous 3 years. Records that, being public and mandatory under the state's dairy waste ordinance, described the whey hauled to the Thorne place in the company's own official language, not as a raw material retained or reserved, but as waste disposed of, released, and removed from company premises for the express purpose of relieving the plant of a disposal burden it would otherwise have had to pay a hauling contractor to take to the municipal lagoon. The case came before the county court in the early summer of 1964. In a modest courtroom that filled with more spectators than the clerk had seen at a civil matter in years. Farmers and feed store regulars and half the Grange crowding the benches to watch Kessler's Montpelier attorney argue that Elias Thorne had built a business on a raw material that was never truly his to keep. The attorney spoke first, laying out the company's position with practiced confidence. That whey remained a substance of latent value, even after it left the cheese vats, that Elias had captured that value through his own system of dilution and metered application, and that the resulting improvement in his flock rightfully entitled the company that had generated the raw whey to some accounting of the profit it had made possible. Elias' own attorney, a mild, unhurried local man named Cyrus Abbott, who handled mostly wills and boundary disputes, and had never argued anything so strange in his career, laid the state's own disposal manifests on the table one by one, each bearing Kessler Dairy and Cheese's letterhead and the signature of Kessler's own plant manager. Each describing the whey in the same flat regulatory language: waste liquid, no reserved commercial value, released for disposal by hauling to third-party land under an approved agricultural application, variants filed and stamped and countersigned by the State Water Quality Board across better than 3 years of biweekly reports. Abbott asked the court a single plain question: whether a company could declare a substance to be regulated waste with all the legal and financial relief that classification provided it for the purpose of avoiding disposal costs and permitting fees, while simultaneously claiming that same substance as retained proprietary property the moment someone else discovered a use for it, and he let the state's own filings answer the question rather than arguing it further himself. Bartholomew Kessler, seated beside his attorney in a suit considerably finer than the room, sat very still as Abbott read the manifests aloud one after another, the same phrase repeating itself until it took on the rhythm of a verdict being delivered before the judge had said a single word. Waste liquid, no reserved commercial value, released for disposal. The county judge, a dry, deliberate man named Osgood Cutter, who had farmed himself for 20 years before reading law at night, took less than a week to issue his ruling, finding that Kessler Dairy and Cheese had, by its own sworn and repeated filings with the state, abandoned all ownership interest in the whey the moment it left plant property under the disposal variance, and that whatever additional value Elias Thorne had subsequently created through his own labor, materials, and system belonged entirely to him. The ruling noting in a line that traveled around the valley faster than the decision itself that a company could not have its waste disposed of and its property reserved in the same breath. Kessler left the courthouse without a word to the reporter from the County Weekly who had come to cover the hearing, and by the time Elias and Gaspard drove back out past the same gate where the tanker trucks still pulled in twice a week, word of the ruling had already reached Speck's store, where, according to Ruth Callender, the room went entirely quiet for a long moment before someone finally laughed, though this time not one word of it was aimed at Elias Thorne. What followed was the part of the story the Valley would go on telling at Grange suppers and church socials for years afterward, a little different in the particulars each time it was told, but always landing on the same essential and deeply satisfying shape. Within 2 months of losing his own lawsuit, Bartholomew Kessler sent not his attorney this time, but his plant manager out to the Thorne farm, hat in hand in every sense, but the literal one, to place a standing order for Elias' method, and later for finished wool from his flock needed now for Kessler's own leased pasture land, since his commercial fertilizer suppliers' prices had grown untenable, and no other approach in the region could match the results Kessler's own agronomist had already quietly confirmed the previous year. Elias sold him the arrangement, and later a modest run of breeding stock off his improved flock at the same fair rate he offered every other farmer who came asking that year, refusing Gaspard's half-serious suggestion that he charged Kessler double out of simple justice, saying only that a fair price was a fair price, and that he would let the arrangement itself stand as whatever justice was owed. The tanker trucks kept coming twice weekly all through that autumn of 1964, still delivering whey to Elias' holding pond exactly as before. Except now roughly every 6 weeks a different truck came the other direction, loaded not with waste but with a check hauling away breeding ewes, and consulting fees bound for Kessler's own leased barley and hay ground 2 townships over a closed loop that struck everyone who heard about it as almost too tidy to be believed. A company paying nothing to dispose of its own waste on one end of a farm, and paying handsomely to license the results of that same waste on the other. Wool prices that autumn held near 44 cents a pound, unremarkable in themselves, but Elias' fleece weights that year across his whole expanded flock ran nearly a third heavier than the county average, a figure that drew a second visit from Delbert Prout, who this time brought a photographer from the State Extension Service for a bulletin piece on liquid dairy byproduct as a pasture amendment. A piece that would eventually be read by sheepmen as far off as upstate New York and southern Quebec. Elias used the extra income that winter to buy a second holding pond and a proper distribution pump to replace the old spreader tank, to hire Gaspard's nephew on part-time to help manage the enlarged operation, and to pay off in full the note against the home 80 acres that had hung over the family since his own father's illness back in 1947. Standing in the county recorder's office on a cold January morning, to watch the clerk stamp the deed clear, the same deed Bartholomew Kessler had once hoped to add cheaply to his own holdings, by way of a dying spring and a bitter old widower. Elias kept his father's fencing hammer on its hook by the kitchen door through all of it, using it still for the first stake of every new ditch line. He laid a small private habit no one in the valley ever asked him to explain, and one he never offered to. By 1968, 6 years after the first tanker truck had backed up to his fence line, meaning to punish him for a spring he wouldn't sell, Elias Thorne had turned that same low pasture into the center of a modest, but genuine regional operation, consulting on liquid whey pasture systems, not only for Kessler Dairy and Cheese, but for 3 other cheese plants, and a creamery across 2 counties, all of them paying him to take their runoff and in growing numbers, paying him again for the flocks and the method the runoff had helped him build. It was a business Gaspard Boucher had become a full and named partner in by then, his signature added to the same ledger Elias had once kept alone at Margaret's old sewing table through a cold, mocked, lonely first winter. Bartholomew Kessler never became a friend exactly. The 2 men settled into something closer to a wary professional respect built entirely on regular, punctual, fairly priced dealings. But Kessler had long since stopped speaking of that spring as something he wished he'd bought outright, and told his own plant manager more than once that he would rather have a reliable supplier than a resentful neighbor, which was about as close as Bartholomew Kessler ever came to admitting he had been wrong about anything at all. Harlan Speck, for his part, eventually began stocking whey testing kits and dilution barrels at the feed store after enough farmers came asking, never quite saying out loud that the demand had started with the man he'd spent an entire winter calling addled over checkers. Ruth Callender liked to remark that Harlan's memory for who had been right about what stayed famously short, whenever admitting it might cost him a customer. The philosophy Elias eventually passed on to his son. When the boy was old enough and curious enough to ask why his father still kept a cracked hand-worn fencing hammer on the hook by the door, instead of buying a new one from Speck's shelf, was never really about whey or dilution ratios or county lawsuits at all, but about the plain stubborn notion that value is rarely destroyed, only misplaced by people too impatient or too certain of their own first impression to look for it twice. He told his son that the old hammer still drove a stake exactly as true, worn and taped as it would have, knew that a thing did not stop being useful simply because someone with more money than patience decided to call it waste. And that the same turned out to be true more often than the valley liked to admit of land of seasons, and now and again of stubborn old men themselves written off by an entire county one hard winter, and proven quietly right without any ceremony at all. By the next one, Elias Thorne died in the spring of 1989, 78 years old, on the same bottomland his grandfather had cleared of stone by hand in 1889, the whey pasture system still running under his son's management, the old fencing hammer still hanging by the kitchen door, its handle wrapped now in a 3rd or 4th layer of tape over the original crack, still doing precisely the job it had always done. There was a stretch that second winter, one the valley never heard about because Elias never told it, when the whole system nearly failed and took the flock down with it. A hard cold snap settled over the hills in late January of 1963, 10 days running where the mercury never once climbed above 0, and the holding pond froze solid enough that the metered ditches backed up and iced over before Elias could shut the intake down. By the time he noticed, 3 days' worth of undiluted whey had pooled and refrozen in a low corner of the pasture, a black-green sheet of ice that Gaspard took one look at and called flatly a dead spot. The kind of scald that would kill the turf down to the crown and leave bare dirt there through the whole growing season. Elias did not sleep much that week, He walked that corner of the field every morning before light with a pick and a bucket, breaking the ice in sections, and hauling it off rather than letting it melt in place, and soak the concentrate straight down into roots that had no way yet to process it, working by lantern before chores and again after dark. His hands cracked and bleeding at the knuckles from the cold before the week was out. Gaspard, who had said almost nothing through the whole ordeal, showed up on the fourth morning with his own pick and a thermos of coffee laced with something stronger than coffee, and worked beside him without being asked, and the two of them cleared better than half an acre of frozen concentrate by hand before a thaw finally came and let the rest drain naturally. When the grass came up that spring, the cleared corner grew in thin and patchy for a season, a visible scar Elias could see from the kitchen window all that summer, but it did not die outright, and by the following year it had filled back in as thick as anywhere else on the place. He wrote the whole episode into his ledger in 4 short lines, dated and numbered like every other entry, and never once mentioned it to a living soul outside the farm, not because he was ashamed of the mistake, but because he had come to believe, the way his father had believed before him, that a man's failures were his own tuition and none of the county's business, and that the story worth telling was the one about what a man did next, not the one about what nearly ruined him. It was that same winter, not long after the thaw, that his son Warren came home for a weekend from his engineering job downstate, expecting to find his father broken down by grief, and a bad idea gone wrong, since that was more or less what the last letter home had implied between the lines. Instead, he found Elias hunched over the kitchen table with the ledger and a slide rule Warren himself had left behind years before working out flow rates for a second holding pond. He wanted to dig that spring, and when Warren, still half convinced the whole scheme was foolishness, asked why his father hadn't just trucked the Whey off like every sane farmer would, Elias only slid the ledger across the table and told him to read the numbers before he said another word about sanity. Warren stayed up past midnight with that ledger, running his own figures against his father's by lamplight, and left 2 days later without saying much, but he mailed a fat envelope of Cornell Extension bulletins and university library photocopies up from Burlington within them. The same bulletins that would later teach Elias the trick with the ground limestone, and from then on a letter passed between father and son every few weeks, dense with soil chemistry and flow calculations neither man would have known how to discuss out loud across a kitchen table, but which somehow said everything that needed saying between them anyway. The court proceedings themselves, when the day finally came in the early summer of 1964, ran longer than a single afternoon, stretching in fact across the better part of 3 days. And the County Weekly covered all of it on its front page, a novelty for a civil matter that ordinarily would have rated 2 paragraphs on page 4 beside the obituaries. Kessler's Montpelier attorney, a tall, silver-templed man named Fenwick, who had a reputation for settling farm disputes before they ever reached a jury, opened not with the manifests at all, but with a parade of figures meant to establish in dollars exactly how much value the Whey represented before it ever left the plant. Calling the company's own chief cheesemaker to testify at length about lactose content, about the cost of hauling to the municipal lagoon, about the years his laboratory had spent trying to find some profitable secondary use for the runoff before giving up and classifying it reluctantly as waste. It was, Elias had to admit to Gaspard that first night over supper, a more polished argument than he'd expected, one built to make the jury feel the company's own frustrated ingenuity rather than its greed. Cyrus Abbott let all of it stand unchallenged on the first day, which worried Elias considerably, since Abbott was not a man given to dramatic pauses, and Elias had begun to wonder, by the second night, whether his mild country lawyer had simply been outmatched by a city man's polish. But on the second morning, Abbott rose, and instead of arguing with a single figure Fenwick had presented, asked the cheesemaker one plain question under oath: whether the plant's own records filed under penalty of perjury with the State Water Quality Board described that same lactose-rich, carefully calculated Whey as anything other than waste with no reserved commercial value. The cheesemaker hesitated long enough that the pause itself became a kind of answer, and when he finally admitted that the filings did use exactly that language, and had used it every single reporting period for 3 straight years, a low murmur went through the gallery that the judge had to gavel down twice. It was on the third and final day that Abbott called Elias himself to the stand, and Elias, who had never in his life spoken in front of more than a dozen people at once, testified in the same flat, unhurried voice he used to report the weather to Gaspard, walking the jury through the ledger itself page by page. The pH readings and dilution ratios and frozen corner failure written down in the same plain hand as every success, because he had nothing in that book he was afraid to have a stranger read. Fenwick, on cross-examination, tried twice to suggest that Elias' meticulous record-keeping proved he had known all along the Whey carried real value, hoping to turn the ledger into evidence of theft rather than evidence of honest labor, and both times, Elias answered the same way: that he had kept careful records because his father taught him a man who measured his mistakes learned faster than a man who only measured his successes, and that nothing in the ledger showed him taking anything the company hadn't already sworn in writing to the state of Vermont. That it no longer wanted. Judge Cutter's written opinion, when it came down that following week, ran to 11 pages, considerably longer than the county court usually bothered with, and copies of it were passed hand to hand around Speck's store for a month afterward until the pages had gone soft at the folds. Beyond the central finding on abandonment, Cutter added a passage that the county weekly reprinted in full, and that Ruth Callender was fond of quoting from memory at the creamery for years afterward, holding that the law could not permit a company to enjoy on one hand every regulatory and financial benefit of declaring a substance worthless, and to reclaim on the other every commercial benefit of that same substance, the moment a more industrious neighbor proved it otherwise. Since to allow both would be to reward exactly the kind of carelessness the waste laws were written to punish, and to punish exactly the kind of diligence the state's own agricultural bulletins claimed to encourage. Elias read that passage once at the kitchen table, with Gaspard leaning over his shoulder the way he had the night the first letter came, and then folded the opinion into the same drawer where he kept his father's original deed to the home 80 acres, and went out to check the sheep before dark. Because there was still a chore to do, and a ruling however satisfying had never once fed a flock. The years after the ruling were not without their own smaller trials, the kind no county weekly ever bothered reporting. A wet, cold spring in 1966 brought about a foot rot through part of the flock that had nothing to do with the Whey system at all, and cost Elias a hard month of doctoring animals by lantern light before the outbreak burned itself out, a reminder, as Gaspard put it, that no ledger and no lawsuit could fence a man off from plain bad luck. A younger sheepman 2 towns overhearing second-hand accounts of Elias' success tried his own version of the system without bothering to dilute properly or to test his soil, and lost a third of a season's hay ground to exactly the kind of scald Harlan Speck had once predicted for Elias himself, a failure the valley discussed for a full winter as proof that Thorne's method was luck rather than skill, until Delbert Pruitt's second extension bulletin, with its careful measurements and repeatable ratios, laid the difference out plainly enough that even Speck's checkers table stopped arguing the point. Elias took no particular satisfaction in being proven right a second time that way. He drove over to the younger man's place himself that spring uninvited, and spent an afternoon walking his ruined ground with him, explaining the dilution ratios and the pH readings the same patient way Delbert Pruitt had once explained them to him, because he remembered too well what it had cost him that first cold winter. To learn those numbers alone by lamplight with no one willing to climb down into the ditch beside him, and he had no wish to watch another man's land or another man's pride take that same beating without at least an offer of the shortcut. By the time Warren brought his own son out to the farm for the first time in the summer of 1971, the operation Elias and Gaspard had built together spanned better than 200 acres under lease and consulting arrangements across 2 counties, and the boy, not yet 10, spent that whole visit trailing his grandfather down the ditch lines, asking why the water in some of them ran green, and some ran clear. Questions Elias answered patiently, and at length the same way his own father had once answered his questions about fence wire and frost dates. Because he had come by then to understand that the whole of what he'd built was really just an answer to a single question passed down, and handed forward the question of what a man does with a thing everyone around him has already decided is worthless. Bartholomew Kessler retired from the cheese business in 1975 and sold the plant to a regional dairy cooperative, and at his retirement dinner, according to an account Ruth Callender swore she had straight from a cousin who'd catered the event, he told the assembled guests, with what witnesses described as genuine and slightly rueful humor, that the smartest business decision of his career had been the lawsuit he lost, since it had handed him free of any further argument. The one supplier in the state who could be trusted absolutely never to waste a single drop of anything. Elias Thorne died in the spring of 1989, 78 years old, on the same bottomland his grandfather had cleared of stone by hand in 1889. The Whey pasture system still running under Warren's long-distance oversight, and a hired manager's daily hand the flock grown by then into one of the most respected border Leicester lines in northern New England. The old fencing hammer still hung by the kitchen door on the day the family gathered there after the funeral, its handle wrapped now in a 3rd or 4th layer of tape laid neatly over the original crack, and Warren, going through his father's things that week, found the ledger still sitting in the same drawer beside the folded court opinion, and the original deed, its last entries dated only a few days before Elias' final illness, the handwriting a little shakier by then, but the columns ruled just as straight. pH and dilution and rainfall recorded to the last, because a man who had spent 30 years learning that value hides itself in the places other people stop looking was not in the end a man inclined to stop looking even at the very last page. The valley told the story differently depending on who was telling it, the way any good story gets reshaped a little by every mouth it passes through, but the version that survived longest, the one Warren himself told his own children years later on the same porch, where his father used to sit with the evening ledger, always circled back to the same image. A lean old man crouched at the edge of a frozen, sour-smelling pasture on a night in 1961, running the runoff between his fingers while a whole valley slept certain he'd already lost. Not because that single image explained everything that came after the ditches, and the dilution ratios the courtroom, and the manifests the trucks that eventually ran both directions through his gate, but because it held. In one small gesture, the whole of what Elias Thorne had actually spent his life proving. That the difference between waste and wealth was rarely a matter of the substance itself, and almost always a matter of who was willing to kneel down close enough and stay curious long enough to look past what everyone else had already agreed to call it. Gaspard Boucher outlived his old friend and partner by only 4 years, and asked before he went to be buried within sight of the low pasture, rather than in the churchyard plot his family had held for 2 generations, a request the Thorne family honored without much discussion. Since everyone who'd known the two men understood well enough that the ground itself had become over 30 years of shared labor, less a piece of property than a kind of quiet monument to a partnership, neither man had ever needed words to explain. Visitors to the farm in later years, agricultural students mostly sent up from the university on the strength of a case study, Delbert Prout's original bulletin had eventually become, would sometimes ask Warren or later his own son what the secret of it all had really been. Expecting perhaps some precise formula, some ratio more exact than the ones already written up in the extension literature. And the answer they got more often than not was simply to be taken down to the kitchen and shown the ledger still kept in its drawer. Still added to every season, its oldest pages soft and gray at the corners from a young man's thumb turning back to check a January reading against a June result. Because the secret, if there had ever truly been one, was never a number at all. It was only ever the willingness to write the number down, and to trust it a little further than the town was willing to.